When I meet people who say you must work really hard, and I'm like, I don't think I've ever worked a day in my life. Like, I really don't. Even the jobs that I've had, I was really lazy at and did not work hard at all. And now at this job, I feel like incredibly lazy. It's that sense of like when I'm doing something that I feel is just easy for me, and it's not even that it's easy, but it's just what I would be doing anyway. You know, it's like it's not separate for me from just my everyday life. It's like the way you would just listen to music, the way you would just do that. Like, it's not something that's difficult for you or that you need to get paid in order to do it. It's just part of what you do, the texture of your life. And for me, that's the same. It's like I make up fictional people and write about their fake lives. I've always done that.
To the Harbour Grace excursion with the voice to have.
Books really saved my life.
We're so happy to have you here. I guess I've got a bunch of questions, but maybe I'll just start off with an easy one. I'm curious, you're the editor of a literary review in Dublin. Could you tell me about what you look for when you are looking for fiction for the magazine, and who do you publish, and what's your vision for the magazine?
Yeah, so The Stinging Fly is a magazine in Dublin. It's been around for 20 years. I just came on as editor at the beginning of last year, 2018. And we put out 2 issues a year. So I've put out 2 issues under my editorship, both in 2018. And the first issue that we published, so I suppose The Stinging Fly really made its name publishing new Irish writing. So we take submissions internationally and we do publish international writing. But I guess what's unique about The Stinging Fly is its sort of its predominance in the new wave of Irish writing that's emerged in the last sort of 10 years or so. The Stinging Fly has really been at the centre of that. And I can say that because I wasn't involved at all then. So we've published a lot of the names that are associated with that new generation in Irish writing: Kevin Barry, Lisa McInerney, Colin Barrett, writers like that coming through The Stinging Fly. And so we're very committed to publishing writers who have never been published before, publishing new writing, both Irish and international. And we have open submissions, obviously, and we get a lot of submissions, as you can imagine. And my first issue as editor, I read like 750 stories. Yeah, which was like a lot. But I really enjoyed it. And it made me think a lot about the question that you've just asked. Like, what am I looking for? Yeah. And it's a question that you obviously bring to the table as soon as you begin reading the stories. You read the first 10 and you're already asking, what am I looking for? But by the time you've read 500, you're asking the question in a new way. And I really started thinking a lot about, like, what is a short story? Why am I reading so many of them? What is the form of the short story, and what makes that form work and what makes it not work? What I'm really interested in, and obviously I just bring my own subjective tastes and preferences, and that's all anyone can do, I guess, in that situation. What I'm really interested in is writing that speaks to the sort of present historical cultural moment. So work that's in dialogue with other contemporary work, and work that feels fresh and new. That obviously doesn't mean every story that I want to read has to be set now in 2019 and have a lot of social media in it or anything like that. But I am interested in work that I feel is speaking to the present moment as it unfolds. And that can happen in a lot of different ways. I'm also interested in stories where things happen. A lot of the stories we get on submission are stories in which nothing happens. Those can be interesting too, but it takes like a really masterful writer to make nothing happening interesting. Whereas even a writer like myself can make it interesting if something happens. I tend to be interested in stories that have a sense of change or development embedded inside the text of the story. That, like, when we meet whatever the characters at the beginning of the story, they're slightly different in some way by the time we leave them, in a way that feels plausible. So I guess that's kind of what I ended up looking for. And I'm sure I had lots of other little quirks and preferences in terms of the style that I was attracted to and the kinds of thematic content that I was most drawn to as an editor. But those were the kind of enduring principles that I found myself returning to as I read all those stories.
And when you are talking about new Irish writing, do you consider or is it considered that the work that you do is part of this new wave? And how how do you see it? Like, how is it defined in contrast to, who is it in contrast to? Is it in contrast to the great Irish writers, or is it in contrast to what was going on 40 years ago? Or?
Right. That's, I think, a really interesting question, because in Ireland, we talk a lot, self-consciously, about the new wave of Irish writing. And so there's definitely a recognition that there is a kind of boom of Irish writing happening at the moment. And I guess I would date that from about 2008 onwards. So, and I think the reason that date is significant is because of the financial crisis. So that changed Irish society in a few really important ways, and I think those aftershocks are still being felt in Irish society now. And so during a period of rapid economic and social development, the literature that emerged with that has felt different from what preceded it, but not in a sense that there was like a really definitive break, because writers like Colm Tóibín, like Anne Enright, Sebastian Barry, are obviously writing now and were writing before 2008, and writing work that certainly is in conversation with the stuff that's, the new generation that's happening now. So I don't think there was like we hit pause for a couple of years and no one in Ireland was doing anything, and then we came back after 2008 and started writing good books again. But I think there was like a change in the kinds of literary conversation that were going on after that. And I suppose the book that changed, that probably is most symbolic of that change for me, is a collection of short stories by a writer called Kevin Barry, and the stories, the book is called There Are Little Kingdoms. And that book, I think, was enormously significant in the sense that it was very influential on the wave of Irish writers that came behind, including myself, and because it was doing something that felt like just intrinsically slightly different from what had preceded it in the Irish literary landscape. So I think that Kevin Barry book, and then the books that came after it, both Kevin Barry's and the work of other writers who were influenced by him and in conversation with his work, I think have changed Irish publishing and writing. Yeah.
So you were studying, you did an MA in American literature. Who were some of the writers that you read that you would say taught you how to write, if I could put it that way, or influenced the kind of work that you are doing now? Like, was there, because you have this sort of very spare style, was that something that you were interested in? I mean, that's a very American kind of.
I'm conscious of that. I think growing up, my idea of good writing or interesting writing was heavily Americanized. The kind of writers that I was drawn to reading were North American. When I was a teenager, I read the J.D. Salinger's book Franny and Zooey, and that for me was like a touchstone of like, that is the kind of book that I want to grow up and be able to write. Like, that is the book. And so that's written in not really a spare style, but in a sort of colloquial and also a lot of the book revolves around dialogue and conversation, and there's a really interest in human speech throughout that book and throughout a lot of Salinger's work. So that was sort of what I thought of as being the most interesting and weirdly the most like modern or contemporary, because I just hadn't read a lot. I guess my cultural references were small, and it was like I didn't have a very systemic way of thinking about literature as a teenager, and I would just kind of randomly find books and then think, oh yeah, this is it, the perfect book. So that was what I did with Franny and Zooey, and it took me like a long time going to university and studying literature in a kind of slightly more serious way to think about, historical movements in schools and literature and stuff like that. And then finally developing an idea of voice and style within that context. But certainly in my early development as a reader, I just thought Americans were cool and I wanted to be like them. Yeah. And maybe that's partly what drew me to studying American literature at master's level as well, as I have always had a fascination for American writing and still do.
Right. So that must be very gratifying to have American critics and readers so interested in your books. And
never thought about that. Yeah, I guess that is pretty gratifying.
So your new book is called Normal People, and in rereading both your books this week, I saw that the phrase "normal people" actually comes up a lot in both books. So, in conversations with friends, for example, it was about 4 or 5 times it came up. One is, when I couldn't make friends as a child, I fantasized that I was smarter than all my teachers, smarter than any other student who had ever been in the school before, a genius hidden among normal people. We all feel that way. I'm just curious, how is that phrase "normal people" useful to you?
Yeah, it used to be really useful to me, and then I called my book that, and now it's immediately fallen out of my everyday vocabulary because I can't use it in normal conversation anymore, which is wounding. I never intended that phrase to be the title of the book. When I was working on what would later become Normal People, I didn't have a first novel. Like I had nobody had ever read Conversations with Friends. It was sort of sitting on my laptop unread, and I started working on this new project about these two new characters. And I thought the working title for that second long work of prose was Scenes from a Friendship. And then obviously Conversations with Friends developed into a proper novel and was published. And
so you're working on them simultaneously, more or less?
Yeah, I came up with the idea for the first one first and sort of worked it nearly to completion, and then started writing the second one, and then later got a book deal. So
and then finished the first one, and then finished the second
exactly.
one. Right.
Yeah.
Okay. How many years was that whole process?
The whole process. What do you mean the whole process?
Well, from starting writing what became Conversations with Friends to handing in your manuscript for Normal People.
That was almost exactly 3 years.
Okay.
Yeah. So started writing Conversations with Friends 2014, late 2014. I want to say like October 2014, and handed in my manuscript for Normal People October 2017. So that's
perfectly 3 years.
That's 3 years.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, if my maths is right.
How old were you at that? What were the?
I guess I was 20. I can definitely work this out because I know what year I was born. I was 23 when I began writing Conversations with Friends, and 3 years on, I was 26 when I handed in Normal People. Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
So did you have titles for them when you were working on them?
Yeah. So I had, the first novel was always called Conversations with Friends, but I didn't know that it would ever be published. I just saved it under that title on my documents, and then kept it there. And then started writing something new when it was sort of still in draft form. So I had written a first draft, maybe written a second or third draft, and then put it away for a bit, and then started work on this new project, which I called Scenes from a Friendship. And then I kept working on that. And later on, of course, the publishing world became involved, and Conversations with Friends went out into the world and was like an object for sale in shops. And then at that point, I had to think of a new title that didn't sound so much like the title of my now existing first book. And I went through a lot of different ones. None of them really worked. And I'm not necessarily persuaded that this one works either. But it's the one that I'm stuck with. And so it means that I have to think about, what is this piece of text that has attached itself to the body of my novel? I don't really know. I guess I'm saying that the characters are normal people, or that they're not. But it's funny because in conversation, like I do tend to use the phrase "normal people," and it has occurred obviously in my first book, as you pointed out. And I like it, and I like to sort of like describe myself as normal in conversation, like, oh, I wouldn't do that, I'm normal. So I find the word normal so much more appealing and like attractive to me than words like ordinary or regular or usual. I just think there's something about the word normal that I like, and so I'm kind of sad that I gave the word away to the book because I can't use it anymore. I know, exactly.
Title your book.
Yeah. Exactly.
I mean, I really like the title, and I think it does work because you think, is the title saying that these are normal people or that they're not normal people? Mm-hmm. Like it works in an interesting way, that title. I know that you're a big Henry James fan, and among other 19th century novelists, and you've said in interviews that you feel frustrated with the limitations of the 19th century novel. Mm. What limitations do you see there, that when you're writing you think, no, I can't exactly do what I love in those books, because what does the 19th century novel not let one do? Yeah,
that's a really interesting question. So like, I'm interested in how the novel emerged as a form and sort of what historical and cultural pressures created the novel. And I see the emergence of the novel in the English language, because I'm not really familiar with any other traditions of the novel, emerging in the late 18th, early 19th century, kind of as a product of the industrial capitalism that was beginning to emerge at that time also. And acting in a way as a philosophical reflection of, or potentially as a sort of philosophical helpmate to, that kind of capitalism, which was a new way of organizing society. And the novel reflected back that new way in a sort of philosophical sense, and gave people a way of thinking about and understanding the new social forms that were emerging at that time. And so the novel is a deeply individualistic way of telling stories. Like, it differs from storytelling forms that preceded it, I think, not exclusively, but largely because it focuses on individuals, the psychology of individuals. And obviously part of the reason that's still so compelling to us is because we're still stuck in the capitalist phase. Like, we haven't moved beyond that in terms of our material relations. So it kind of makes sense we haven't moved beyond it in terms of our cultural products. So we're still stuck with the novel. And that's fine, I like novels, but I do feel like they are a product of particular historical and material circumstances, right? So there are some things that I feel concerned by. When I find myself doing things that work in a novel, why do they work? Do they work because they reproduce particular ideas that I don't actually want to be reproducing? Like, do they work because they're echoing the status quo in a way that feels satisfying, but not actually confronting the status quo in sort of meaningfully? And I think, like, in the 19th century novel, you can also say that's true of gender in a big way. Like, female characters who are really subversive, who really offer a challenge to the patriarchal living conditions of women in the 19th century, a lot of the time end up dead in the 19th century novel. And like, including in Henry James, and obviously in Madame Bovary, Anna Karenina in The Idiot, like, these women who really manage to subvert and transcend those sort of confining rules of society end up under the train. So I do find that fascinating, that those women cannot be confined by the limits of the novel, that they cannot actually survive their insertion into the form of the novel. I do find that really fascinating, and I think we've overcome that now. Like, we don't have to kill those characters anymore, and that's a big win. But But I do wonder that I do think in other senses, thank you so much, we have the novel hasn't really managed to go beyond the boundaries, that the kind of limited formal plot boundaries that were sketched out for it in the teleology of the sort of 19th century novel. And that concerns me a bit, because I'm not always aware of what I'm replicating when I'm writing a novel, because I'm not necessarily able to get the critical distance from it while I'm doing it.
Well, one thing that seems different to me, which seems like I don't know if it's not a replication or if it's the opposite or something, but I feel like the novels that you're talking about, the problems for lovers in those novels is that there are these institutions and they have to break them in order to experience love, right? They have to have affairs or whatever. Whereas in your novels, it sort of seems like those institutions don't even exist. And the characters, in some sense, are struggling to love in the absence of any institutions, And in some ways, that seems like that's an opportunity for them to experience true love. But also, in many cases, there's this drop and then there's no love, because the institution does provide some kind of continuity. Do you see that there's something... I don't know if that's because they're young or because it's this moment in history, or if it's because how you feel about the novel that happens in both books.
Yeah, I mean, like, I think there has been, and I know, speaking from an Irish context, and apologies if I'm repeating myself, but there have been obviously these huge social, cultural developments. And one of the institutional forms that's no longer applicable in the way that it would have once been historically is obviously the institutional power of the Catholic Church. So that's deteriorated hugely in its power over Irish society, and like the texture of everyday life in Ireland is no longer structured by the Church in most meaningful ways. And so then I think what my characters are confronting to some extent is like, what has replaced that value system? I think, most of us would agree that set of institutions was incredibly repressive. And of course, violently abusive in many cases. But as a organized body of philosophy, what came to replace it when it sort of just attenuated out of existence? And I think that those are probably some of the questions my characters are confronting. Like, what is the philosophical answer? We no longer have religious dogma. We have a very individuated capitalist social framework, which doesn't really provide sort of like a moral ethos or like a philosophical set of answers, or even really a philosophical set of questions. So I think, my characters are probably navigating a social world in which the dominant moral frameworks have fallen away and haven't necessarily been replaced by equally like philosophically complex solutions. And I think that's definitely a concern for me in the abstract. But I often think my abstract concerns do end up in the books, even when I don't necessarily intend to put them in there. Like, I end up circling around the questions that occupy me, even though my fiction takes place on such a small scale, like in intimate relationships between people in a series of rooms. But I think that the questions that preoccupy me as a person in my normal life also sort of bleed into the novels in one way or another.
Yeah, how could they not? When you're editing, so I know with conversations with friends, there was 100,000 words or something after your first, after you got it all out. Any process of editing is a moving towards something. What are you trying to move towards? I mean, I find your novels very suspenseful. There's a lot of other qualities. There's a strange quality in which rooms, you said they happen in rooms, but rooms don't seem very important to you. Dialogue does. The characters trying to understand what they're thinking is very important. When you're taking 100,000 words to 60,000 words, is it that you see the final book in your mind and you're trying to like make it that shape, or what are you doing?
Yeah, most of the time, my drafting consists of like, I begin a draft when I meet these characters, and usually they'll have some kind of little intriguing dynamic that will interest me, and I want to know more about the dynamic between them. Or they'll be meeting each other for the first time, in which case I want to know, how do they get to know each other? In what direction does their relationship sort of spin off? And most of my editing takes the form of having sent the characters down the wrong route. Right. So I'll just make a decision to have them get together or not get together, or fall out, or have some conflict, and then I'll write 40,000 more words on the basis of that, and then realize they never should have had that conflict to begin with. So then I have to go all the way back, delete the 40,000 words, meet them back at the point where I made the wrong decision, and then send them into sort of another room, as it were, and follow them somewhere else instead. So that's what the editing mostly is for me. It's almost never a case of trying to like cut down words or reshape things. It's just a case of having made the wrong decision at some point and trying to find out where I made the wrong decision, so I can unravel everything I did after that and just go back to that point.
And what makes it the wrong decision? What makes it the wrong direction?
It's that it gets less good after it, you know? You know, it's like I'm reading the draft and I'm like, this is pretty good. And then I get to a point and I'll go, it's just not good anymore. So where did it go wrong? Right. And sometimes what's really annoying is you have to cut stuff that is good because what comes after it doesn't work. So you can give your characters like a really, and interesting from my perspective as the writer, but like interesting for me, argument, or you can give them an interesting confrontation, or you can put them in an interesting situation they've never encountered before, and that can work. But what it does is unbalance their equilibrium in a way that makes the rest of the novel not work. So you have to go back and take it out and find some other direction to send them in. So it's very much a case of being prepared to delete a lot of what I do, and I delete more than half of what I do. So for both of the books, I kept a like deleted scenes file. And in both cases, the deleted scenes file was longer than the actual work. So I have to just be prepared to do that and not be precious about it. Just be ready to delete basically everything all the time, and not to allow it to demoralize me. And that can be a challenge as well, because it is demoralizing deleting. I assume some of you in the audience are writers. Deleting 40,000 words, if any of you are writers, that's a lot to be deleting. So that can be demoralizing. But yeah, so it's just a case of like, keeping the faith that I can find something to make these characters do that will unlock whatever I'm trying to learn about them.
Right. And that's how you feel, like that writing the novel as a process of trying to learn who these characters are.
Yes, yes. And I guess, to be honest with myself, also to make them learn something about who they are. So, like, it's not enough for me simply to meet them and follow them around for a couple of days where not much is going on in their lives and then leave thinking, I know those people really well now. Something has to happen to them that makes them learn something about themselves or each other. Like, I have to have a sense that something has changed for them. And I don't know why I have to have that sense. Sometimes I kind of blame myself on it because I think a lot of the writers that I really love reading, they're not constantly chasing the sense of change and development. They're not always looking for the moment of like revelation or epiphany. They're able to just write about the stasis in people's lives. And that's an interesting thing to read about. So I don't know why I'm always chasing after change and development. It's like I feel I need to be doing it, and I don't know why I need that. But it is what I do, and I do judge myself by that standard, rightly or wrongly. Most of the scenes that I write, I'm interested in whether they've actually changed anything. And if the scene hasn't changed anything, usually it's not working for me as a scene. So that's kind of my method, which I'm attached to because it's what I do, but I'm not attached to it philosophically. I think I could probably find other better ways of working, but that's the one that I use at the moment.
It's interesting because you keep coming back to this sort of questioning of your motives and you or your philosophical position, which is your instinct, really.
Yeah.
And you wrote this interesting essay, was it in the Irish Times? Yes. Mm-hmm. Sally wrote this really interesting essay in the Irish Times where she was talking about, it was sort of like an apology for writing her novels. And you basically, I want to quote you because it's you wrote a good piece.
Thank you.
You said, there's a part in me that will never be happy knowing that I am just writing entertainment, making decorative aesthetic objects at a time of historical crisis.
I would agree with myself there. Yeah.
It's like, what's wrong with that? So the question that comes up for me there is there a way to write books that moves them beyond being simply decorative aesthetic objects? Novels. I don't mean any kind of books. I mean specifically novels. Mm-hmm. Can you see that in a future books or?
Yeah, well, I ask myself this question a lot. And I mean, I think if my aim was to intervene in political discourse, then I would write works that straightforwardly attempt to make that intervention and just lay my case out, because I have a lot of trust in people, and if I wanted to make a point, I would make it. I wouldn't make it by telling a complicated story in which fictional people move through rooms a lot of the time. I would just say whatever I wanted to say and see if people agreed with me, or there were counter arguments that I could respond to. That's the kind of way I would go about it if my intention was simply to make an intervention in a particular form of discourse. I don't know that I have anything to add to discourse in that way. I think all my beliefs are just taken from things I've read written by people who are smarter and have thought a lot more about these issues than I have. So and I have what I would describe as strong convictions, but I don't think that they're new. So I don't know that that I have much to add to. I don't think I have many interesting interventions to make in the discourse in that way. What I do have are ideas for novels, and then I write them, and then I castigate myself for not having made more sophisticated interventions in political discourse. But I do think that it's a serious question. Like, what is the point of making art that may be obliquely political, or maybe what I would say attentive to political circumstances, which is the sort of least that I would ask of myself in the work that I do. But what is the point of doing that when we're at a time of crisis? And I don't know what the answer to that question is. And I don't think that the answer is necessarily in the novel, for all the reasons that we've discussed, and also because if you're writing a novel for that reason, you should be writing something other than a novel. And I think that does beg a question. I guess one answer might be that it's easy for a lot of us to see what we're struggling against, but it's not always so easy to remember what we're struggling for. Like, what is what is the meaning of human life? Why even go on with all this? Why are we caught up in a struggle if there's nothing pleasurable in our lives, nothing that gives us joy? And for me, certainly not for everyone, novels are one of the things that make life worth going on with. And so I suppose that means I have to believe at some level that it's worth somebody writing them. And if I can be one of the people who writes them, so much the better for me. I don't. So I guess like that's the answer that I have to persuade myself of, and I don't know that I have persuaded myself.
There's something that humans are like suspicious, I feel like, of things that come easily to them. So writing novels seems to be, not that it's not hard work, but something that is native to your brain or your spirit or something. And there's a way in which we can be so suspicious of that because it's easy for us, and feel like something that's that easy can't have value. I'm not to say that your critique of the novel is not legitimate, but I also think that's also an element for me when I talk to artists or people who are good at, extremely good at something, that it's almost like it's just breathing to them. There's a way in which it just there's a quality of undervaluing it.
Yeah, and I mean, I do find it largely easy. I do find it kind of easy. And I meet people who say you must work really hard, and I'm like, I don't think I've ever worked a day in my life. Like, I really don't. I mean, even the jobs that I've had, I was really lazy at and did not work hard at all. And now at this job, I feel like incredibly lazy. So it's that sense of like when I'm doing something that I feel is just easy for me, and it's not even that it's easy, but it's just what I would be doing anyway. It's like it's not separate for me from just my everyday life. It's like the way you would just listen to music, the way you would just do that. Like, it's not something that's difficult for you or that you need to get paid in order to do it. It's just part of what you do, the texture of your life. And for me, that's the same. It's like I make up fictional people and write about their fake lives. I've always done that. And I presume I will always continue to do that. So it just feels like that's part of, and I actually need that. It's like a psychological coping mechanism of some sort. It helps me to make sense of moving through the world and living life. I need to make up fake things and write about them. And so the evidence of that need has now become my livelihood. And that's fine, but it is hard to feel that it's like hard work for me, because it's just not. Yeah.
Something that I think is hard work. You've had a lot of success with these books, and I want to quote you something, because you were a top debater in Europe, and you, one of the reasons that you stopped doing that, you wrote in this really interesting article in the Dublin Review, you said, success doesn't come from within, it's given to you by other people, and other people can take it away. In part, that is why I stopped competing. I didn't want to give up the feeling of flow, that perfect self-eliminating focus, but I didn't want to perform it for points anymore. Academic life had presented me with much the same problem. Maybe I stopped debating to see if I could still think of things to say when there weren't any prizes. So you wanted to get out of the world of prizes, and now, ironically or tragically, you find yourself back in it as a fiction writer.
Prizes all over again. Yeah.
Is there
what
some
can you
sense? Do? This is your characteristic life experience. Is there some sense of an interruption in this private joy, flow, ease, with the introduction of this structure that you've entered as a published and successful novelist, in which you are being given prizes, and the expectation is, well, surely Sally will write books that will win us more prizes. And is there any feeling of, well, how do you feel about being in yet another, some sense, competitive, unfortunately, realm,
Yeah. I do feel, well, first of all, I feel like it's too early for me to say, because it's all happened quite quickly. And I definitely think I'm still acclimatizing to it and finding ways to think about it. I'm not necessarily a very quick thinker because it's been going on for like, a year or two, and I still haven't really managed to think about it in any way that makes sense to me. So I'm still trying to feel my way through it and to come up with ways of thinking about and conceptualizing the world of publishing and the fact that my books are out in the world in a way that I feel comfortable with and can stand by, and also a way that means I can answer questions like this in a superficially plausible sounding way. But there's and I think it's a section from your book Motherhood where you talk about the sense of feeling like when your work goes out into the world it becomes kind of dirtied, and that and that resonated with me so much when I read it. And I mean, the thing is that it's an enormous privilege, obviously, to be able to make a living from writing, and I'm very, very thankful for that. But it does mean that I become the ambassador of my work in a way that I don't feel qualified to be, or equipped to be. Like, when I was working on my own, writing fiction to amuse myself, I still really wanted it to be good. I never wanted to do with sloppy work, just even for myself. I was always trying to get it to be better. And I would edit my own work even when I didn't think anyone was going to read it, because that's what I wanted to be doing. I wanted to be doing something I thought was good. But I never had the sense of myself as a person having to speak on behalf of my work, or to answer questions about my work, or to even stand in any kind of relation to my work, because it was just something different from me that I didn't feel connected to. And the thoughts and opinions and feelings that I might have and the experiences that I happen to have undergone in my life didn't really seem relevant to thinking about that work or reading it. And now, of course, I am indelibly connected to the work that I have written because it was written by me. But I didn't feel that to be the case when I was writing it. Like, I didn't want it to be connected to me in that way. I guess, like, I would love, and I think a lot of writers would love, if the text could just speak for itself and I would never have to interact with it or engage with it in any way. Not because I'm not interested in my books, but because I have a fear of not doing justice to them. And because I fear speaking about them in the wrong way, and I fear my own authority speaking about them. It's not something that I don't necessarily want to be seen as the authority on my own books. I'm sure there are people who have much more interesting things to say about my books than me. But it so happens now that I've been placed in this relationship with the texts because I'm the person who sort of produced them. And I do find that a tricky thing, honestly, to think about and to make sense of for myself. So that's something that I have found hard. And also going back to the, that thing about success being given to you by other people, and not wanting to take seriously the books as cultural products, like not wanting to know them in that way, wanting always to know the books the way that I wrote them and to have them in my sort of documents folder and to know them in that way, but never really to know the books as objects of discourse out in the world. And I think that's just because I have to keep my head down and write the next book and do the next thing, and that exposing myself to the eyes of the world in that specific way would be harmful for me as I try and do something new. But I don't know why I think it would, but I just think it would.
We have 5 minutes before we take questions from the audience. These things always go so fast. I'd like to talk a little bit about love and true love, because I feel like that's the topic of your books. And one thing that I find interesting in your books is that you have a fascination with the inappropriate match somehow. The popular boy with the unpopular girl, or the poor boy with the rich girl, or the young woman with the older married man. And I think traditionally when people are interested in mismatches, it's because they're trying to say something about desire, how desire is kind of random, or it doesn't go along with who we think we should love. But I don't feel like that's what's going on in your books. I feel like the reason that the mismatches work is because they find a realm of privacy with each other, because they're mismatched. Their relationships don't further any of the systems that they're part of. It doesn't further the hierarchy of popularity in the high school. It doesn't further, like, the bourgeois whatever marriage. and that's why they have a sense of privacy with each other, and that's what they're going for in love. That's my reading of the books, and I wonder. You're shaking your head.
No, it's such a good reading. I haven't. I'm so interested to hear you say that. I'm so conscious of returning again and again to clandestine relationships.
Yeah.
I really have written a lot about relationships that take place for a multitude of reasons in my stories and in my novels, that take place outside the gaze of the social world, that are kept secret from people's families and social circles. And I've never thought about that specific reason that you've just outlined, that there's actually something about the privacy that gives those characters that allows them to conduct their relationships in a different way. That actually, by exempting themselves from the surveillance of the social world, they're allowing themselves to have a kind of romantic relationship that isn't transactional, because it can't be, because no one is witnessing the transactions that are taking place. There's no currency exchange going on, because it's away from the world of transaction, of give and take. It's away from cultural capital and social capital and marital capital and all that. I've never really thought about it in the way that you've just described before, and I think there's something really true about it. And I have been curious. Why do I keep writing about secret relationships? You could say it's because I like writing about things that have a little frisson. Like, that's interesting to me. And so if something's secret, there's always a little bit of a question mark hanging over it. Why is it secret? How long will it remain secret? And those are fun things for a novelist to play with. So that's definitely partly what's going on. But I think there's also a deeper concern there. Like, I'm not just doing it for my own fun, but I'm actually interested in relationships that take place away from public scrutiny, away from social surveillance. And why? Why am I interested in those? And I think you've hit on something very true. It's that by taking them out of the realm of sort of transactions between personal capital, that there can be something that transcends that kind of transactional relationship completely. And I am very attracted to that idea. And I think that's probably very true. I think that's really interesting.
You're writing a screenplay of Normal People for BBC Three.
Mm.
I'm curious if you want to talk a bit about that. Say whatever you want about it. But my real question is this flow state that one gets into when you're writing, or when you're doing anything at sort of when you're doing your debating, when people are doing anything where they lose a sense of their own selfhood, and they're just sort of in the moment. Do you get into that flow state when you're adapting Normal People for the screen?
I have managed it a couple of times. Yeah, I have. It's very different because it's much more collaborative. I've been working with really great people, and I've been really excited by their ideas. But collaborative work intrinsically is so different from what I've been doing up till now.
So you're not writing it alone?
No, I'm not writing it alone.
Oh, so you've got a room of writers?
Yeah, no, not a room. So I kind of wrote drafts of the scripts, and then another screenwriter gave notes on that, and then we worked together. And so It's not like a whole gigantic team of people, or at least not yet. But I have been working with other people on the scripts, which I definitely needed, because I've never written for the screen before. So there's a lot of technical stuff that I didn't understand. But also, other people have really interesting ideas about what we should do with it, which I'm interested to hear. And because I'm kind of just, I'm the one who came up with the way that I told it in the book. So obviously I'm sort of fixed on that, and people who don't bring that baggage to it can have sort of more interesting ideas about different ways of retelling the story. So that's all been good. But I do find it harder. I think because I just have a novelist's brain, I find it harder to get into that sort of flow state you've described when I'm not in total control of what I'm doing. So for me, it's like if I've got my Word document open and I'm master of that domain and I can move the commas wherever I want them to go, then I can access that state quite easily. But if I'm collaborating with another person, and I regret this in myself, I'm certainly not bragging about it, I do find it harder to sort of click into that state, because I guess I just naturally work better alone, or I work differently alone. But it has been an amazing experience, and it's also very gratifying to see that people bring their own readings and interpretations of these characters and are excited about working with them, because these characters, Marianne and Connell, the protagonists of my second book, they're kind of very dear to me. I know they're not real, but they're dear to me anyway. And it's very touching for me that they've become dear to other people, I suppose. Right. And so that part of it has been hugely enjoyable. yeah, it's a very different way of working, and it's not one that necessarily I find is like innately easy to understand as I find the novel. But I do find it very exciting.
Great. One last question before we go to the audience, because I just want you've said before that when people ask you about your connection between your own lived experiences and what you write about, you said something so beautiful, and you said that when people ask that question, you feel they're trying to take away the accomplishment of writing these books from you. They're trying to take that accomplishment away, as though. Can you say something a little bit more about that when people just say, well, is your whole novel true? Did that happen to you? Did you have this kind of same relationship?
Yeah, I mean...
What's underneath that, do you think?
Well, I think there are different things underneath it. I think some people may ask from a because they themselves have had similar experiences, and then they just want to connect with me as a human being, and I totally understand that. I do think some people ask because they want to be reassured that I didn't make it up. Because there's something, I think that people would feel more comfortable sometimes if they thought that I just sort of passively lay there and all this stuff happened to me, and then I went and wrote about it later, but I wasn't the active agent, the instrument of having invented this reality. I think that there's a way in which that's something that's easier to understand or absorb, or that they would prefer to be talking to me if that's who I was, rather than be talking to me as the novelist who invented it all. And so I think, but that's not to say that I think everyone who asks questions like that is coming from that particular perspective. But I do think sometimes that question is a way of wanting to be reassured that I didn't make all this up in my brain, because it would make people uncomfortable to think that I did that for any number of reasons.
What reasons?
Well, because it's kind of an intimidating thing to do. Why would anyone do that? Like, I think it's a weird thing to have done in your brain. It's a weird thing to have invented all these people who don't exist and put them through their paces and made them suffer so much and stuff. Why? Like, it's a weird thing to do, and I think people find it like a little bit creepy or uncomfortable. And it would be more reassuring for me to say, well, no, this is just stuff that happened to me, and I had to write about it for cathartic reasons, like to get it out. But I'm afraid I made it up, guys. I made it up, and I can understand. I can understand, and also, as I say, I think there's also just a sort of inert fascination sometimes to just know whether where novelists get their ideas, or like, are they drawing on their real life? And so there are a million different reasons why people might ask that question. But I think, yeah. There's maybe a discomfort. Maybe it's a gendered discomfort sometimes. Maybe it's to do with my age sometimes. I don't know why. But I think, yeah, sometimes it's a sense of not wanting to credit me with the invention of all these circumstances, and wanting to believe that in fact they are derived from my having simply lived an exceptionally active life. Yeah, which I haven't. So. Yeah, I think maybe that's answering the question. I'm not sure.